Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i special time. Thank you for indulging us. Nina and I are going to a wedding. Very happy for our dear friend Josh. His daughter's getting married, and so we wouldn't be available later today, and that's why we're doing it now. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Wednesday special time? Yehudit in South Carolina, and I'm so glad you're here. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Yehudit Sobel in memory of her dear father, Moshe Avigdor Ben Meir HaKohen. May your dad's memory always be for a blessing. May you have a tremendous aliyah and elevation in the next world, in the world of souls. We say amen. And Yehudit, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. We say amen. Also, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in Yonkers today, Bill in Mid-Missouri, John in Maine. Today is my 81st birthday. Happy birthday, Yom Huledet Sameach, John. So good to have you with us every day. Paula in the Great Northwest, and also Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. We reload. Okay, today's daf, continuing the same discussion we've been having about how the Canaanite slave is acquired and how he acquires himself, meaning how he is emancipated. But I gotta say that today's page is fascinating, right? Fascinating. We're going to be getting into the kind of discussion we've had before about how the sages derive a law, how they can interpret the Torah to understand situations where it does not explicitly apply. And, you know, where sometimes that discussion gets dry and difficult to follow. I feel like today we have a wonderful example about how the rabbis, how the sages would expand a law be a little bit wider than what's explicitly mentioned in the Torah, but being so careful not to go too wide. And today's example, I think, is just so visual, compelling, and understandable. So let's get into it. So we were discussing the issue with the Canaanite slave as opposed to the Hebrew slave whose servitude was temporary. The Canaanite slave's servitude was permanent, and nevertheless the Torah granted certain rights to the Canaanite slave. And so we've been discussing how the Canaanite slave is freed. And the problem is that since the Canaanite slave has no legal identity separate from his master until he is freed, so how can he receive his bill of manumission? Right? The master has to give it to, it doesn't become a valid bill of manumission until it leaves the master's domain, so to speak. Just as when a husband gives his wife a get, the husband has to give it to her, and then it leaves his domain. But how does the master give that bill of manumission to the slave if the slave has no independent legal identity of his own? It's like the master is giving that bill of manumission to himself. Or if somebody's going to give money to that slave in order for him to purchase his freedom. Now, obviously, the third party who's providing the money for that could just give it to the master. And then purchase the freedom of the slave. But if for some reason, that didn't work, could that person give the money to the slave and say, this is on condition that this money is used to purchase your freedom? And could he put it in the hand of the slave for that purpose? And the answer is yes. And there would be different explanations for that. One explanation is that, well, it's being given to the master, and in that case, the slave is acting as the master's agent by receiving his money for him, although the master has to consent, right, to part company with the slave that he's going to take money for and go free. But another explanation would be that somebody gives money to the slave on condition that that money does not belong to the master, but that the slave can use it to purchase his freedom from the master. And that was problematic because if you put money in the hand of the slave, even if the third party specifies on condition that this money doesn't belong to the master, it can only be used for you to purchase your freedom from the master. Well, when you put it into the slave's hand, it became the property of the master. Or did it, right? That's the discussion that we've been having, and Rabbi Meir and the sages disagree on that. So we continue at the bottom of page 23b. So the Gemara raises a contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Meir and a second statement of Rabbi Meir, and it raises a contradiction between one statement of the rabbis and a second statement of the rabbis, right? It means that the Rabbi Meir and the sages had a dispute in one area of the law, and they had another dispute in another area of the law, and their positions in those two disputes seem to contradict each other, meaning Rabbi Meir's position in one dispute seems to contradict his position in another dispute, and likewise for the sages who argue with Rabbi Meir. So we're at the top of 24a. And so we're going to look at, we've been looking at this area of the law of the Canaanite slave and his master, and now we're going to compare that to a law that occurs in the arena of Meiser Sheni, right? Second tithe. So second tithe, as we've discussed many times, when the temple was standing, so a farmer in Israel would tithe his produce. And how would he tithe it? First 2% goes to a priest. Then 10% of what remains goes to a Levite. Then 10% of what remains in most years, 4 out of the 6 years, or let's say 4 out of the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle, it's called second tithe, and it's used for the farmer to go on the pilgrimage festival to Jerusalem, right, for Passover, for Shavuos, for Sukkot, and to be able to enjoy himself and get to Jerusalem and have what to eat during the week-long festival. So what if what he grows is watermelons? What's he going to carry a sack of watermelons to Jerusalem so that he has what to eat while he's in Jerusalem? No. So he can turn the watermelons into money and then carry the money literally tied up in his hand to use that only for, his expenses during that pilgrimage festival. Okay, so that's using second tithe. In 2 of the 7 years it's just given to the poor. But in 4 of the 7 years, it's used for this, going to Jerusalem on the festival. Okay, so when you are changing your second tithe into money, right? You're redeeming the second tithe, right? You're going to now turn it into money. Now, what we're going to see is that there's a distinction between when a person turns his own second tithe into money so that he can use it in Jerusalem, versus basically when he sells it to someone else, right? So that, or when somebody else redeems the second tithe. When a person redeems his own second tithe, the Torah mandates that he has to add a fifth to it, so that he shouldn't be tempted, to sort of, cheat the holy. When he's redeeming his own tithe, he has a little bit of a safety cushion built in that he has to add 20% of its value. But whereas when somebody else redeems, produce that happens to be second tithe, but they're just basically going to purchase it, then they don't have to add the fifth. So the question is a wife considered her husband's agent when she redeems his second tithe or not? A woman may not redeem her husband's second tithe without adding 1/5 of its value to the redemption money, as is required from all of those who redeem their own second tithe, right? So there, that indicates that if a man was redeeming his own second tithe, he'd have to add the 20%. If his wife does the redeeming of his produce, she also adds the 20% because the husband and wife are like one unit. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Meir, a woman may redeem second tithe without adding 1/5, meaning she's treated like any other person. So she's independent of her husband in this regard. And the Gemara inquires, what are the circumstances of the case that we're debating? If we say that she redeems second tithe with her husband's money, which he gave her for this purpose, and the tithe belongs to her husband, in this case, she acts with the agency of her husband, just as he is required to add 1/5 when he redeems his own second tithe. It is clear that she too must add 1/5. If she's clearly acting as his agent, redeeming his tithe with his money, of course she has to add 1/5. So rather, one might say that this case is referring to a situation where she uses her money to redeem his tithe. Well, now she's like any other person outside of the household redeeming his tithe and does not have to add the 5th. And how does she have her own money, you might ask? Well, she brought money into the marriage, or she has separate earnings from her own career outside of their marriage. So she's using her own money. So in that case, she doesn't add the 5th, right? But in that case, this is also difficult, as in this case, the rabbis would agree that she is exempt from paying the additional 5th. Why would the rabbis say she must add a 5th if she's using her own money? Because as the Merciful One states, if a man shall redeem any of his tithe. The emphasis of the term man teaches this applies to a man, but does not apply to a woman who redeems her husband's tithe. Right? It's only when a person redeems his own tithe he adds the 20%. If anybody else, including his wife, is using their own money to redeem that produce, they don't add a 5th to it. So rather, is it not correct to say that we are dealing with a case like the following, where another person transferred 100 dinars to the wife and said to her, I am giving this to you on the condition that you redeem your husband's tithe with it. And if so, we heard them, Rabbi Meir and the majority, the rabbis, say the opposite with regard to the issue of whether such a condition is effective. Right? In the case of the slave, they came out in opposite sides of this argument. According to Rabbi Meir's reasoning presented in the case of a slave, anything a woman acquires should be acquired by her husband, because that's what Rabbi Meir said about a slave. Anything a slave acquires is actually acquired by his master. So if Rabbi Meir was going to be consistent, it would seem that anything the wife acquires is simultaneously acquired by the husband. So if somebody said to her, here's some money on condition, right, on the condition that you use this money to redeem your husband's produce with it, well, what does that mean? Did the husband acquire that money, or did she acquire that money with it? So how then could Rabbi Meir rule that a woman redeems second tithe and adds the 5th? Additionally, the rabbi said that the money received by the slave is not immediately acquired by his master, and yet here they consider the money received by the wife as belonging to her husband. So Abaye said, well, the way out of this apparent contradiction is reverse the opinions in the case of redemption of tithes. Rava said, no, you don't reverse the opinions. Here, with regard to tithes, we are dealing with tithe she received from her father's house as an inheritance. And Rabbi Meir conforms to his standard line of reasoning as he says, tithe is property that belongs to the temple treasury. And therefore, the husband does not acquire it. When she inherited tithe from her father, second tithe from her father's house, that doesn't go to her husband, because technically it belongs to the temple. So she is its custodian, and her husband doesn't become her custodian for her. So therefore the husband does not acquire it, unlike the regular property that a woman brings to her marriage. Consequently, a woman can redeem it with her husband's money without adding 1/5, because it's like she and her husband would be redeeming tithe that really belonged to her father and technically belonged to the temple, but never was her property nor her husband's property. That's why they don't have to add a 5th when they redeem it. And the rabbis conform to their standard line of reasoning as they say tithe is common, i.e. non-sacred property, i.e. it is not owned by the temple treasury. And second tithe is not owned by the temple treasury, unlike other tithes. And consequently, the husband acquires it like other property of his wife, to whose profits he is entitled. Therefore, she performs with the agency of her husband and must add the 5th. Okay. That is how we explain the difference in Rabbi Meir and the sages with regard to whether a slave can acquire something independently of his master, and then comparison, can a wife acquire something independently of her husband. Now we move on back to our Mishnah. We've been discussing Mishnah number 3 or 2. Mishnah number 3, here in chapter 1. And that Mishnah stated that the Canaanite slave is emancipated through a tooth and an eye, and through permanent damage to other extremities that do not regenerate if they are severed. So let me just read that verse. It's Exodus 21, 25, and 26. So that we understand what it is that we're talking about, right? Exodus, what did I say, 25? No, Exodus 21, 20. Where am I? Exodus 21, chapter 21, verses 25 and 26. Yep. Okay. And it says, sorry, I didn't have that ready. And it says, right, it's 26 and 27, right? Exodus 21, 26 and 27. Okay, if a man shall strike the eye of his slave or the eye of his maidservant and destroy it, he shall set him or her free in return for his eye. That's the first verse. Second verse. And if he, the owner, knocks out the tooth of his slave or the tooth of his maidservant, he shall set the slave or maidservant free in return for his or her tooth. Now, you might have thought, isn't it enough to say, okay, so if the owner of the Canaanite slave, knocks out the eye, then the slave goes free. And then the Torah specifies also the tooth. If you knock out the tooth, the slave goes free. First question is, wouldn't we have learned the case of the tooth by the case of the eye? Why does the Torah have to specify both? And that's the first question they're going to ask here. So here we go. So a Canaanite slave is emancipated through a tooth and an eye and through permanent damage to other extremities that do not regenerate if they are severed. That's what our Mishna said. The Gemara asks, granted a tooth and an eye, these body parts are explicitly written, as the Torah states clearly, that if a master damages a tooth or blinds an eye, the slave is emancipated. But from where do we derive that if the master permanently damages other extremities, the slave is likewise emancipated? And the Gemara answers, these extremities, like if you chop off a finger, these extremities are similar to a tooth and an eye. Just as the removal of a tooth and an eye leads to exposed, meaning external blemishes that do not regenerate, so too the same applies to all blemishes caused by the slave's master that are exposed and that do not regenerate. Right? So if the master of a Canaanite slave injures the slave, but the slave will heal from that injury and not have permanent damage, right? A scar doesn't count as permanent damage, but the loss of an eye, the loss of a tooth, the loss of an extremity, the loss of an ear, the loss of a finger, those would count as a permanent blemish that sets the slave free. So the Gemara asks, but one can say that the examples of a tooth and an eye are like two verses that come as one, i.e., they teach the same matter. And we have a principle that any two verses that come as one do not teach their law so that it can be applied to other cases. Meaning, since the Torah could have made this point either by specifying if you damage the eye or if you damage the tooth, then the slave goes free, and we could have learned out, okay, if you damage the body in such a way that it will not regenerate what is cut off, then the slave goes free. And we could have learned that from either the eye or the tooth. Now that the Torah taught both the eye and the tooth, we have a principle that when the Torah specifies two examples where one would have sufficed, so we have a principle that the Torah comes to tell us these are the two examples where that law applies and no others. Right? So if we really could have learned out this law from either the eye or the tooth, then the fact that the Torah specified both the eye and the tooth in subsequent verses means that the Torah is coming to tell us that these are the only cases where if you damage the slave goes free. So how did the rabbis of the Mishnah come and say that if you chop off a finger, or if you chop off a thumb, if you chop off an ear, if the master does that to the slave goes free? Why would you extend that law beyond the eye and the tooth now that we have a principle that where two examples are given where one would have sufficed, that the Torah limits that law to those two cases? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary to mention both the eye and the tooth, as neither law could have been derived from the other. The eye and the tooth do not teach the same case. The eye and the tooth were both necessary because the eye teaches half of the lesson and the tooth teaches the other half of the lesson. And without both, we would not have learned the complete lesson. We would not have learned the complete law that the Torah comes to teach us. And the Gemara will explain. Because they each add information to the law, because they each add a different understanding of what that law is, they are not two verses that come to teach the same law. And the Gemara explains, as if the merciful one had written only a tooth, that if a master damages, knocks out a tooth of his slave, the slave goes free. If only the tooth had been mentioned in the Torah, then I would say that even a milk tooth, meaning a child's tooth that will eventually fall out to be replaced by another, would be included in this law, right? If the master owns a Canaanite slave who's a child, and somehow comes to strike that child and knocks out a baby tooth, that child slave should go free. And that is not the case. Therefore, the merciful one writes I to teach that this law applies only to a body part that does not regenerate. An adult tooth does not regenerate, but a child's tooth does. If a child loses a tooth, another tooth will grow in its place. And if the merciful one had written only I would say, I would say that just as an eye was created with this person in the womb, so too this law applies to anything that was created in the womb. But with regard to a tooth which grows later, perhaps he would not be emancipated if the master knocked out the tooth. Therefore, it is necessary to mention both cases. Now we're on 24b. So you see, we would not have really understood the law unless both cases were mentioned. Now that both cases needed to be mentioned in order for us to understand the law, there's no redundancy. Since there's no redundancy, the sages are free to bring in their hermeneutical tools, create exegesis and find what do the eye and the tooth have in common, right? Now we talk about their differences. Now we ask, what do they have in common? It's an external permanent damage that causes the slave to go free. So what are other cases of an external permanent damage that would also cause the slave to go free? And that's how the sages are going to derive that if any of the extremities get permanently damaged, like a finger gets cut off, the slave would go free for that. Right, so the Gemara first says, but one can say the following argument. In Exodus 21:26, right? If a man smites, right? So depending on the translation, we read it as, if a man shall strike the eye of his slave or the eye of his maidservant and destroy it, he shall set him free in return for his eye. Okay? So now they're going to break down these phrases, and sometimes the translation is just a little bit different, right? So one can say the following argument. When it says, if a man smites, or in the art scroll, if a man strikes, this is a generalization, right? When a master strikes, right, hits the servant, the Canaanite slave, this is a generalization. There's all different kinds of ways in which the master could physically damage the slave. It's not just that he hits him with his fist or with an open hand or with an instrument or causes the slave to be hit. This is a generalization. It's a lot of different ways that the slave could suffer damage, physical harm at the hands of the master. So this is a generalization. If the man, or in this case the master, strikes. That's the generalization. Now, a tooth and an eye in the subsequent verses, this is a detail. First the Torah says, if a man strikes, referring to the slave, and then the Torah specifies, it gives the detail, either the tooth or the eye. This is a detail. So if so, this should be read as a generalization and a detail. Now we have one of the 13 principles that we read every morning in the prayer book from Rabbi Yishmael. One of them is that when the Torah gives a law in the form of a generalization followed by a detail, this is used by the sages to understand that any law that we're going to derive from that verse has to be limited. How? Like this. If so, this should be read as a generalization and a detail. And the hermeneutical principle in a case of this kind is that the generalization includes only what is mentioned explicitly in the detail. Consequently, a tooth and an eye are included, but not other matters. So if this is a generalization followed by a detail, well, then that would mean that if the master causes the harm, and either the tooth or the eye are what is harmed, then the slave goes free. But if the master causes harm and it's not to the tooth or the eye, then the slave does not go free. Now that's not where the Mishnah ended up, but that's the argument that's being made now. So the Gemara answers that when each verse states, to freedom shall he send him, now we generalize again. So there's a difference between generalization and a detail versus generalization, detail, generalization. When we follow the generalization and detail with another generalization, in other words, the verse goes on and tells us what the outcome is going to be, and it speaks in a more general manner. Now we have a different hermeneutical principle, generalization, detail, generalization, which means that the sages may expound that there are other cases similar to what is the common denominator of the eye and the tooth. Right, and to freedom shall he send him. It then generalized again. Consequently, this should be read as a generalization and a detail and a generalization. And in this case, the hermeneutical principle is that you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. So just as the explicit detail is an external blemish that does not regenerate itself, so too any body parts that are exposed and become damaged, like calling it a blemish here, and that do not regenerate themselves are included in this law. And that's how the rabbis were able to say that if the master, strikes the slave in such a way that causes him to lose one of his 24 extremities, then the slave goes free. And the Gemara asks, if so, one can limit this category even further. Just as with the explicit details, right? Because now we have to say, what does the eye and the tooth have in common? So one thing is it's external. You can see it. It's not internal damage. If you damage, if you knock out a tooth or you blind the slave in one eye, that eye won't grow back. The tooth won't grow back. So that's what they have in common. But maybe they have something else in common also. And what is that? Just as with the explicit details, they are referring to exposed blemishes, and the body part is prevented from performing its regular function and does not regenerate, so too, a slave should be emancipated as a result of an injury to all exposed blemishes that do not regenerate and where the body part is prevented from performing its regular function. Okay, now if you lose one eye, you could say, well, you could still see with the other eye, but we all know that your eyes see in stereo vision. If you lose one eye, you lose your depth perception. So, just the fact that you can still see with one eye doesn't mean that you have the same function you had before. If you lose a tooth, you could argue, one tooth missing. The guy can still chew, but he has a gap in his mouth. His jaw is definitely, his mouth is not what it was before when it had a full set of teeth. Okay, but so now we've added that what they have in common is it's external, it's visible, it does not regenerate, and it causes a loss of function. So why then is it taught in a baraisa? If the master pulled out the slave's beard, right now we're not talking about our Mishnah, but in a different teaching of the sages, a baraisa, contemporaneous with the Mishnah, it says not only that if the master knocks out the eye, the tooth, or any of the extremities that do not regenerate, right, like fingers, toes, ears, etc., but also if the master pulls out the slave's beard and dislocates a bone in the slave's jaw, then the slave is emancipated by means of this injury. Now, a beard will grow back. I mean, it sounds very painful. It's an awful master, but the beard will grow back. But if in pulling out the beard, he dislocates the jaw, now you might say, well, a dislocated jaw will eventually heal, won't it? So why does this kind of injury lead to the slave being emancipated? And it does, right? If the master pulls out his beard and dislocates a bone in the slave's jaw, then the slave is emancipated by means of this injury. In this case, however, there is no loss of function. So if we say that loss of function is another part of the common denominator, the eye and the tooth, and here there is no loss of function, why does that baraisa hold that yanking out the beard and dislocating the jaw is the kind of injury that would emancipate the slave? And the Gemara answers that the two verses say, to freedom shall he send him. And this is an amplification, which includes an injury that is not exactly the same as the detail. Now, we're actually getting into a place where the hermeneutical principles being discussed, one was generalization and detail. Okay, so only the examples that are in the detail are included in the law. That would be only the eye and the tooth. Generalization, detail, generalization. Okay, that means that anything that is similar to the examples given and what they have in common, that's what led to the other 24 extremities. Now we're talking about amplification. Amplification comes from a different hermeneutical principle, which goes like amplification, specification, amplification. And amplification is more inclusive than generalization, right? So now that they're saying it's not just examples that have the exact same qualities as the eye and the tooth have in common, but even that are similar to what the eye and the tooth have in common. And so this would allow the sages to be more expansive in sort of writing down cases that would lead to the slaves being emancipated. And you can see that the sages, who are even though they lived in the ancient world, they're not pro-slavery, right? They're finding ways to limit the reach of slavery. So the Gemara asks, but if it is an amplification which includes additional injuries, the slave should also be emancipated even if the master struck him on his hand and it withered, meaning became temporarily paralyzed, but would eventually be expected to regenerate. I mean, that sounds like, well, if the master breaks the slave's hand, right, or somehow struck it, so like temporarily paralyzed, I mean, sounds like, especially in the ancient world, they have x-rays. Okay, broken bone, it's going to be for, until it actually heals. It might take a really long time, but it will heal, right? So it will heal. That should not be the kind of injury that leads to emancipation. But if you're saying that, the pulling the beard and dislocating the jaw would create emancipation, then why not the broken bone or this case of temporary paralysis? But why then is it taught in a baraisa if the master struck him in his hand and the hand withered, but it will eventually regenerate? The slave is not emancipated by means of this injury. And the Gemara answers, if so, that even limbs that would eventually regain their function are included in this law, what purpose do the examples of tooth and eye serve? These two items that are explicitly stated in the verse would not exclude anything. Rather, only injuries similar to the details of an eye and a tooth are included, but not temporary injuries. Okay, that makes sense. That's where we were headed when we were at generalization, detail, generalization, right? We said injuries that are exposed, that do not regenerate, that cause a loss of a body part that does not regenerate, and that cause loss of that function. So we're still wondering why pulling the beard and dislocating the jaw would lead to emancipation. So the sages taught, with regard to any of the 24 extremities, if a master strikes his slave and injures him there, the slave is emancipated by means of these injuries, and he requires a bill of manumission from the master. This is the statement of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Meir says he does not require a bill of manumission, Rabbi Eliezer says he requires it. Rabbi Tarfon says he does not require. Rabbi Akiva says he requires. Right? So all these sages are arguing that if, let's say the master in the obvious example blinds his slave, right? Knocks out one eye. That's what the Torah explicitly mentions. The slave goes free. So the question is, does the slave go free at that very moment? He could just leave. Done. Or is it that the slave goes free, but the master has to provide him with a bill of manumission, which would probably be useful to the slave, that he would forever have this document that shows, I might have been a slave once, I'm not a slave now, here's the evidence. So does the master have to provide that bill of manumission or not? Some of the sages say yes, some say no. Those who discuss matters and decide before the sages say the following compromise. Rabbi Tarfon's statement appears correct. Right? Rabbi Tarfon says the slave does not require the bill of manumission when the master knocks out his tooth or eye. Rabbi Tarfon's statement appears correct with regard to a tooth and an eye, since in these cases the Torah explicitly benefited him, meaning because his right to emancipation is stated explicitly in the verse, the slave does not require a bill of manumission. Boom. His eye got knocked out. His tooth got knocked out. He's free. Period. End of story. He doesn't have to wait for a bill of manumission. Rabbi Akiva's statement is reasonable with regard to other limbs. Why? Because it is a rabbinic penalty. The Torah said that the master knocks out the tooth of the eye. The rabbis enlarged the law through interpretation and said any of the 24 extremities that are visible, that would not regenerate if they were permanently damaged, would cause loss of function. The rabbis said that the slave goes free by any of those injuries. And so Rabbi Akiva is saying, so eye or tooth, that's by Torah law. Any of the other extremities, that's by rabbinic law. So if it's by rabbinic law, we're going to buttress that freedom, as it were, with the bill of manumission being required in addition. The Gemara is puzzled by this claim. Is it a rabbinic penalty? We interpret the verses, and therefore this law applies to the other limbs by Torah law. We're not saying that the rabbis created this law and its penalty that the slave goes free. We're saying that that's how the Torah said that. It just didn't say it explicitly. We had to, see it in the text, even though it wasn't explicit. But it's the Torah that says the slave goes free for any of these examples of permanent damage to an extremity. So rather, these sages meant that it is necessary to give a bill of manumission because it's a rabbinic interpretation and not written explicitly in the Torah. Same idea, that because it's not written explicitly, we require the master to give that bill of manumission in case anyone had a doubt. No one would have a doubt if the slave lost his tooth or his eye at the hands of the master, but in case people weren't familiar with the law that if he lost his pinky, he also goes free, we buttress that situation by requiring the master give the bill of manumission. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Right? Rabbi Shimon says we require the bill of manumission. So the Gemara says, what is the reason that Rabbi Shimon requires the bill of manumission? He derives a verbal analogy between the phrase sending away, meaning to freedom shall the master send him, and sending away in the case of the husband who sends his wife out when he divorces her. And when you divorce your wife, you have to give her a document. You have to give her the bill of divorce, the get. Likewise, when the master sends his Canaanite slave away, he has to give him a document, says Rabbi Shimon. That's the bill of manumission. Just as a woman can be released from her husband only by means of a document, so too a slave can be released from his master only by means of a document. And Rabbi Meir would say that if the term freedom was written at the end of the phrase, i.e. if the verse had stated, he shall send him away to freedom, it would be, as you said, that he must be given a bill of manumission before he can be emancipated. But now that the Torah rather words it like this, to freedom shall he send him, as opposed to he shall send him to freedom, this indicates that the slave was free immediately when that extremity was damaged, the eye, the tooth, or the finger, and therefore no further act of emancipation is required. The sages taught in a Baraisa, Tosefta Bava Kama 926, if a slave owner struck his slave on his eye and blinded him, or on his ear and deafened him, and then the slave is emancipated by means of these injuries. Well, didn't we already say that? Well, the ear is added, right? So if you hit the slave on the ear and he becomes deaf, he goes free. That's even if you didn't cut off the ear. If you hit him in the eye is still there. You didn't put the eye out. You didn't stick a knife in the eye, but you punched him in the eye and now he can't see. So even though there's no apparent damage to the eye, but the man is blinded in that eye, then the slave goes free. So now we're starting to expand the law a little bit. It's not so visible. It's an external organ, the eye, the tooth, the ear, but it doesn't seem like it's been cut off or permanently damaged. Its function is lost, but the eye is still there, the ear is still there, and yet the slave goes free. However, if the master struck near the eye, and as a result the slave does not see, or near the ear, and the slave does not hear, then the slave is not emancipated by means of these injuries, because now he didn't punch him in the eye, he just punched near the eye. Somehow the slave lost his vision, or he punched near the ear, not in the ear, and yet somehow the slave lost his hearing. Now the damage is 1 degree removed in terms of causation, and the slave does not go free. Rav Shemin said to Rav Ashi, is this to say that a sound that causes damage is nothing? But didn't Rami Bar Yecheskel teach a baraisa with regard to a rooster that stuck its head into the airspace of a glass vessel and crowed into it, and the noise broke it? The owner pays the full cost of the damage like a regular case of damage. Whoa. Right? So he's saying, like, you've seen, at least in a movie or on TV, right? An opera singer, bang, and the glass breaks, right? Now, would the glass have broken if the opera singer didn't hit that high sustained note? No. So even though the singer never touched the glass, never even came near the glass, the voice caused the damage. And likewise here, if the rooster crowed so loudly that it broke the glass, we hold the owner of the rooster liable for breaking the glass. And Rav Yosef said that the sages of Rav's study hall say, with regard to a horse that neighed, or a donkey that brayed, and they thereby broke vessels in the house, their owners must pay for half the damage. Although these two examples are different, as one results in full payment and the other in half payment, it is clear that sound can be a source of liability for damages. So if we're going to say that somebody's animal makes a noise that's so loud, or presumably even if their own voice made a noise that's so loud that it broke physical objects, and that person, or the owner of the animal, the one who made the sound, is liable for what was broken, then shouldn't we also say that if the master of the slave created a sound that was so loud that it deafened the slave, then even though the ear is still there, but he lost his hearing, then maybe the slave should go free. Now, before we continue, let me just say what the law, and that is the law, right? If a rooster stuck its head inside a glass vessel to reach spices inside the vessel that the bird wanted to eat, and it broke the vessel by crowing, not by knocking it over, but by crowing, its owner pays the full cost of the damage for the spices, but half the cost of the damage for the vessel. If the vessel was empty, it is considered unusual for the bird to act in this manner, and the owner is required to pay only half of the damage. The law is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, not as stated in the Baraisa here, but nevertheless, you see that there is damages paid for a rooster that crows and breaks a vessel. If a horse or a donkey broke a vessel by neighing or braying, its owner pays half the damage. The causation is a little bit attenuated. It's not like the horse knocked over the glass vessel, but it brayed or neighed so loud that it broke that vessel, so the owner is partially responsible. So are we going to apply that principle now to the master, the Canaanite slave, who causes him to become deaf, and therefore the slave should go free. Maybe yes, maybe no. Let's keep reading. Rav Ashi said to him, a person is different. A person is different than a glass vessel. How is a person different? Since a person is mentally competent, it is he who frightened himself. It was not the physical sound that caused the damage, but the slave's subjective fear, which is not a direct result of the action. This is almost like, imagine, the game kids play all the time. Somebody walks into a room and you pop out from behind the corner and go, boo, right? Just to startle the person. What if you go boo to startle someone and, somehow they have like a mental conniption and they're deafened by that? It's funny, I was just talking to my father yesterday where he lives in his community in Florida. He likes to go bike riding. And a lady in the same community was driving, and she was behind him, and she honked, right? She didn't touch him. She honked her horn. And he's been working on his temper, he told me. So he didn't say anything, but then at the next stop sign, he pulled up next to her and said, why did you honk at me? And she said, oh, I just wanted you to know that I'm there. She was, in her mind, saying, oh, I'm helping out the cyclist so that he should know that there's a car coming up behind him. He said to her, when you honk behind the cyclist, you could startle them and cause him to swerve and fall, right? And you might do much more damage with that unnecessary horn honk than if you would have just remained silent and kept your distance from the cyclist. Now you can see both of them have a point. But my dad's point is that a sound that startles can definitely cause damage. But in terms of, it's a reflex, right? It's not like the person can help it. But nevertheless, a person is contributing to that harm, right? A glass vessel is only going to break if the sound is incredibly loud and sustained. The thing starts vibrating and shatters. It had no independent agency. But if a person is startled because they're easily startled, because they're already walking on eggshells, as it were, because it's a nervous disposition, and you startle that person, well, then the person contributes to any damage that ensues, is being suggested. Let's keep reading. As it is taught in a Baraisa, in the Tosefta Bava Kama 6:16, that injury can result from being frightened. One who frightens another and causes him injury is exempt according to human laws, but liable according to the laws of heaven. Very interesting, right? The fact that one is startled and then that, leads him to have some kind of an accident or, be hurt, right? It's because he himself is somehow contributing to that. And the one who caused the startle just through some kind of sound never touched him. Right, so the sages, you could say that, well, there was direct causation, but it wasn't really direct. Somebody who makes a loud sound in his own backyard, he has no way to know that I'm in my backyard when the stereo got cranked up and I'm like, ah! And I was standing near my pool and I fell in the pool. He had no way to know that his action of turning on his radio loud might cause damage to me on the other side of the fence. So it's a very indirect causation. So we're not going to charge damages for it. But you should know that if you're acting in a way that is negligent enough that even though you won't be held accountable by the laws of human courts, you may well be held liable and accountable in the heavenly court. So that's something to be mindful of as we're heading toward Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the days of awe, when we are going to be judged, right? We know that there are kinds of damages, injuries that we inflict on others that will never result in a lawsuit and an award of damages, but that truthfully we are responsible and we will be held accountable. How so? If one shouted into another person's ear and deafened him, he is exempt in the human court. But if he held him and shouted into his ear and deafened him, right? If he grabbed him by the shoulders and shouted in his ear and deafened him, then he is liable, even in the human court, because he put his hands on the person and held him there while he was shouting and the person couldn't get away. Makes sense. The sages taught in a Baraisa in Tosefta Bava Kama 9:9, in a case where the master struck the slave on his eye and weakened his vision without blinding him, or he struck him on the tooth and loosened it, but didn't knock the tooth out. If the slave can use the eye or the tooth now, the slave is not emancipated by means of them. Okay, I damaged his eye or I damaged his tooth, but he's going to regain the use of the eye. He's going to regain the use of the tooth. So, of course, the slave doesn't go free. And if the slave can no longer use them at all, well, then the slave is emancipated by means of them. That's the obvious case. If he can no longer use the eye, if he can no longer use the tooth because of the damage the master inflicted, the slave goes free. It is taught in another clause in that Baraisa, in a case where the slave's eye was weak prior to this incident, and the master blinded it entirely, or if the slave's tooth was loose and his master knocked it out, so if he was able to use them before the master struck him, the slave is emancipated by means of them, and if not, then the slave is not emancipated by means of them. Right? So if the guy was already blind in one eye, and I struck him in that eye, well, I didn't cause him to lose the use of the eye, so he would not be freed by nature of that injury. But even if he had a very weak eye that was so fragile that even a little tap could cause the eye to go blind, so it's not foreseeable that little tap, it's not like the master was some kind of awful guy going around punching, whipping his slaves, right? He gave him just a little tap, a little punch. Hey, you weren't listening to me. Hey, and that little tap wouldn't damage anybody. But the slave had such a fragile eye that little knock caused him to go blind. Yes, then he goes free. And in modern common law, we call that the eggshell skull rule, right? The fact that an action that you did, that it was either negligent or intentional, for a normal person would have resulted in very small damages, perhaps none. But in this particular fragile person, caused tremendous harm, does not excuse you, right? If the underlying action was a negligent action or an intentional action, the fact that normally would result in no damage, but in this fragile person did result in damage, is not a defense under the law. That's the eggshell skull rule. The Gemara comments, and it is necessary to state both laws despite the fact that they apparently teach the same law, that a weakened eye is not considered a significant injury, meaning he can still see afterwards. As if the Tan had taught us only this first law, I would say that he is emancipated because at the outset his vision was strong and now his vision is weak. But here in the second Baraisa, where his vision was also weak at the outset, I would say that he is not emancipated as if the master blinded him entirely, as his eye did not function properly even beforehand. Therefore, it had to be taught to us that no, if he goes from a very weak eye to no eye, he goes free. If he goes from a strong eye to a weak eye, he does not go free. And conversely, if the Tana taught us only this second law, I would say that he's emancipated because he blinded him entirely. Okay, he had a very weak eye to begin with, but after the master struck him, he's entirely blind in that eye. But there, where he did not blind him entirely, it just went from, I would say no, he is not emancipated despite the fact that he weakened his vision. Therefore, it is necessary to state both laws. The sage taught in a Baraisa, I'm almost done. Yeah, I'm getting close to done. Questions or comments, get them in. The sage is taught in a Baraisa in a case where the master was a doctor and the slave said to the master, paint my eye with medication. And the master blinded the slave in the process. Or the slave asked the master, who's a dentist, to drill his aching tooth, and the master mistakenly knocked it out. Well, then the slave laughs at his master because he's emancipated, right? The slave instigated the action and actually said, please heal my eye or heal my tooth. And something went wrong in the procedure and the slave ended up losing his eye or losing his tooth. Then even though the master was not being malicious at all, nonetheless, the slave lost the eye or lost a tooth, he goes free. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that the verse, and if a man strikes the eye of his slave or the eye of his maidservant and destroys it, to freedom shall he send them for his sake. Well, this phrase, and destroys it, This comes to say that in the case of this doctor master, the slave is not emancipated. Why? Because the master did not intend to cause destruction. He was intending to heal. If the master intended to heal, then the slave is not freed, even if the master did in fact injure him. Nice argument, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, but you lost on this argument, because even in the case of healing, a slave is emancipated by injury to one of his extremities. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe Rabban Shimon Gamliel is right. A slave is emancipated by injury to one of his extremities only if the master harms him intentionally. Consequently, if the master stuck his hand into his maidservant's womb to assist her in giving birth and blinded the fetus is not emancipated because the master had no intent to touch the fetus's eye. Nevertheless, Rabban Shimon Gamliel was wrong. If the master was a doctor and the slave asked him to medicate his eye and the master blinded him accidentally, the slave is emancipated. See, the difference isn't what the master's intention was. The master was intending to heal the slave, but the master intentionally touched the eye, right? Whereas when he's helping the slave give birth, and, he's not trying to touch the fetus's eye. There was never any intent at all to even touch the eye when he reached in to help the fetus emerge. But where he was asked to heal the eye and he put his hand purposely on the slave's eye, even though his goal was to heal the slave, and then something went wrong in the procedure and the eye ended up being blinded, slave goes free. The Gemara asks, and the rabbis, what do they do with this verse? And destroys it. Why? What do they derive from this? Right? Since the rabbis, the majority, overruled Rabban Shimon Gamliel and said that even though the master was intending to heal, nevertheless he put his hands on purpose on the slave's eye, and then that ended up, the procedure ended up blinding the slave, so the slave goes free. So what do those rabbis do with that phrase, and destroys it, that Rabban Shimon Gamliel was using to teach that no, he has to intend to harm, otherwise the slave is not emancipated. So the rabbis, what do they do with this verse, and destroys it? The Gemara answers, they required for that which is taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Lazar says that in a case where the master stuck his hand into the womb of the maidservant to assist her in giving birth, and he blinds the fetus in her womb, he is exempt and the fetus is not emancipated when born. And what is the reason? As the verse states, and destroys it, meaning unless he intends to destroy it. And in this case, he did not mean to touch the fetus's eye at all. Right? He intended to touch the eye when he's intending to heal it, but he put his hands on the slave's eye. When he accidentally made contact with the fetus's eye while helping her to give birth, he had no intention of touching that eye, and that's the difference. And the other sage, Rabban Shimon Gamliel, would say that the law is derived from the fact that the verse could have said, and destroys, but instead says, destroys it. And the other sage, meaning the majority, how do they respond to this argument? They do not expound the difference between destroys and destroys it. They maintain that this is not a significant deviation from which one can derive a law. Rav Sheshes says, in a case where the slave's eye was blind and the master removed it entirely, the slave is emancipated by means of this injury. Whoa! The slave was already blind in that eye. And then the master struck him. He didn't make him blind. Why would the slave go free? He was already blind in that eye. But the master did change permanently the appearance of the slave. The slave had an eye in the socket. It just didn't work. Now the master, strikes him in such a way that the eye comes out. Okay, well now he has, an empty hole in his face. He couldn't see with that eye before, but nevertheless, the master has done an irreparable harm, and that's why the slave goes free. And the Tana of Baraisa also taught the law of unblemished status, i.e. that an offering must not contain a blemish when offerings were brought to the temple when the temple was standing. And the law of male status apply to animal offerings. But the law of unblemished status and the law of male status do not apply to bird offerings. And the Gemara comments, one might have thought that if one brings a bird whose wing is dried or whose leg is severed or whose eye was removed, that too is acceptable as an offering. Therefore, the verse states, and if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering from the birds. And this phrase indicates that only some birds can be sacrificed as offerings, but not all birds. And this teaches that a bird can be disqualified due to a blemish, just like a sheep or a goat could. For example, if a significant part of the bird is missing, for example, a limb, the bird is not acceptable as an offering. This indicates that the actual loss of an eye is considered a greater blemish than mere blindness in that eye. Consequently, if the master takes out the slave's blind eye, he is emancipated. And we will leave off there. I'll take a couple of comments and questions. Okay. On Kiddushin 24. Wasn't that an exciting journey? Sometimes especially when they get into exegesis and understanding how we expand the law from the generalization, the amplification, it gets so technical that it's hard to follow. But I feel like this example, the manner in which the rabbis expanded the law that frees the slave from harm to his eye or his tooth to harm to any of the 24 extremities, really, it landed for me. I was really able to follow it, and hopefully I was able to communicate that clearly, but also where they left off. And it's not that any harm to the slave leads to his freedom. So it's a good example how the sages would expand the law, but only so far. Sharon, is public humiliation considered a permanent damage? It is definitely a permanent damage with respect to the law of damages, right? That you have to pay damages, monetary damages for harming a person's reputation, for humiliating him publicly, etc. That is in the law of damages. But apparently it's not under the law of damage that would cause a Canaanite slave to go free. I don't think that they would read that in, where this has really been physical damage. That is permanent. That won't regenerate. That causes loss of function. I don't think that it would be included enough to free the Canaanite slave. And Aoife, how can a woman have her own money, even by her own earnings, if everything she receives belongs to her husband? If true, she is different from a slave. She is different from a slave for sure. We make comparisons in these two areas of the law, but it is definitely not the same. And I think we saw that how does a woman have independent earnings? There's a couple of different ways. One is if the husband, let's say she makes more money than he does. So he says, I won't sustain you. Right? My salary, which is not sufficient, will not be used to sustain you. Right? We're going to use your salary to pay for our house and our food because she makes a lot more money than him. Okay, so then he's not liable for sustaining her, and any earnings that she makes are not his. Right? Whereas normally, especially in the ancient world, maybe she could bring in a little bit of money on the side, doing what was available to her. He would make the bulk of the money, so he was liable, for sustaining her, right? Everything that she had, he had to give her, right? He was absolutely on the hook that she should have shelter, that she should have clothes, that she should have food, and in the manner to, which she was, from the home she was coming and the home she was creating. He couldn't live like a king and give her substandard quarters. He had to sustain her the way he himself is sustained. And if that is the case, then her earnings accrue to him, as it were. But it didn't have to be that way in the case I just explained. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.